Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me tonight. I think we got a different stream tonight, but I think it's going to be a good one. I think you're going to like it. I brought a default friend on tonight. She's somebody that I ran into on Twitter and does some really interesting kind of takes on Twitter and has a Substack talking a lot about kind of relationships and kind of in the modern world. And I thought it'd be good to kind of bring her on and get her perspective on some of the things that we have been chatting about. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So for people who might not be familiar with kind of what you do, would you mind kind of maybe telling people what you do and how you got started with the Substack and everything?
Sure. Yeah, my Substack's a little bit of it's like a patchwork quilt. It's mostly an advice column, but I also post fiction and my observations about the world, and sometimes I'll write an article about tech. I mean, it's really all over the place. It's basically me trying to relive the blogosphere.
Yeah, and that's kind of been the beauty of Substack, right? Is it's you're kind of seeing that come back in force for the journalists are landing there, kind of finding their own thing, finding their own way, and you're also seeing kind of the return to the classic blog. So that's been nice.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's it's really like inspired me to write a lot more too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have that outlet and you've got a dedicated audience and it gives people ways to kind of support things, but you're not beholden to, one particular style or one particular genre. So that's definitely nice.
Totally.
Yeah, it's something I kind of like about the YouTube channel too, as well. You can have kind of a primary thrust, but you can kind of get out of your comfort zone, and you still have people who are interested in hearing what you have to say. So that's definitely nice. But the reason I wanted to bring you on is, we've kind of talked a little bit on Twitter back and forth before, and I've noticed that you've got kind of an interesting strain of thought because from what I've seen, you kind of do very modern, takes on, like you said, advice columns, relationships, that kind of thing. But you also seem to have a good respect for some of the aspects of, I think, relationships that maybe are a little more traditional that a lot of people have left on the wayside. I thought it was an interesting mix because you're not writing the biblical advice column for the local Catholic Church, but you're also not you're not writing kind of this super you're bringing things into kind of modern advice columns that I think often get left behind. And so I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how you got started giving advice on relationships and that kind of thing, and how you've brought some of that aspect into what you talk about.
Yeah. So it's funny. My Substack actually started as like events listing, in the just for the Bay Area. And then I ended up doing like a meetup. And it was really about getting like Bay Area nerds out of the house. And then COVID happened, so that stopped being sustainable. Definitely wasn't able to just meet internet strangers and, try a new Chinese restaurant or whatever with them. And around the same time, a friend of mine who has a very unique background himself was telling me that he really wanted to write more and that he wanted to create more and he needed a creative outlet. And I was like, well, I have this Substack that's just kind of sitting here and I haven't repurposed it for anything. Why don't you try giving advice, and I'll work with you and I'll be like your partner in this. So that way, if you like it, you tried it in a kind of safe environment. And then if you don't like it, like no big deal. It's not like you started this whole thing and then, just changed your mind. So anyway, this was a startup guy. So he got busy with his startup and he kind of fell off the radar. But I realized like, wow, I actually really like giving advice. So, I'm like 71 posts later, here I am still writing it.
Yeah, so like I said, I like the kind of the mix of what you've been talking about, and like I said, one of the things that we started talk a little bit about recently was kind of Larping, and this idea. A lot of people throw around this term Larping, live action role playing, and a lot of people use it to describe people who are trying to kind of act out certain lifestyles in the modern world that don't really fit, that they don't really work. Because that was kind of the original idea of this, is people kind of doing these role playing games but in real life. And so people have taken up that term and they've applied it to people who are kind of acting out these classic lifestyles, or trying on these different identities from kind of outside the modern culture, and are now trying to bring them forward into the modern day. And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the term, because in some ways it is useful. Like, we are in a weird period where kind of people have so lost their culture that they often will go into this mode of trying to graft something else onto it. They'll try to adopt something from outside or bring something from the past and kind of awkwardly force it into things. But at the same time, I see a lot of people throwing this term around at really anybody who's trying to do anything besides the kind of super atomized online dating casual relationship. Like any attempt to break outside of that paradigm is also considered LARPing. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on kind of people who on that term, and the phenomenon of people kind of using old culture or different culture and trying to use it today. And what part of that do you think are like a legitimate criticism, and what parts of that do you think maybe are something that people are trying to do to try to change the way that things are happening in the modern day in relationships?
Well, one thing I've been trying to square sort of recently is I think a lot of these conversations are happening within a certain subset of people. And that's not to say that these are the only people involved in these conversations, but I do think the heart of it, they're really anchored in the American, or at a bare minimum, the Western upper middle class. So I think that's very important. I've been thinking a lot about how, I'm around a lot of these kinds of people. Like I'm around this sort of cosmopolitan, atomized culture in my personal day-to-day life. But when I think of like my family back home, like everyone's sort of, like romantically normal is the phrase I've been using. And I've been wondering a lot about like, why is it that the community I grew up in seems a little bit more stable, well, a lot more stable than these communities that I've drifted into. So I think it's worth noting that like people who throw the accusation of like so-and-so's a LARPer, it's like from upper middle class people to upper middle class people. And it's these competing reactions to a real cultural trend that I don't think is totally widespread. So that's sort of the first layer. The second layer is, I understand the impulse to label people that way. I get very annoyed myself when I see some of these, like, especially like women-oriented, advice givers, or like just, content creators, where they're kind of masquerading as though they're giving, they're doling out this like hard-earned wisdom, or like something that maybe like a hypothetical like mother may have told their daughter, but it's clear that they're kind of like making it up as they go along, and it feels inauthentic. And I think what annoys people is not necessarily going against the grain of the mainstream, but this like simulation of what someone who is reacting thinks a more stable way of life is. And it comes off as really like, wait a minute, like nobody told you this. You're just assuming this is the right way to live based on something you heard. And it gets tricky because they're not always wrong, right? Like I agree with a lot of the trad mindset, but the way it's communicated is often like it's missing some pieces, it's missing some experience. And I think that's what sets people off, and why people start throwing the LARP accusation around.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's a good point. Because the point of that wisdom, like you said, is that it's hard earned, and that it would in most cases be handed down in a generational fashion. And so when you kind of repackage it in this very commodified, version when you're bringing it in like a YouTube channel or advice or something in a way that it feels almost inauthentic, because that's not the way that knowledge ever would have been distributed. Normally it would have been through a community, or through a mother to a daughter, or an older friend, or an aunt, or someone in the community, or an institution. It wouldn't have been in this in the way that you're talking about, where it could have been kind of packaged as content for somebody. And so I hadn't thought about that way, but that is interesting, that could create that kind of backlash from people when they hear it, because just the sound of it sounds like something that has been repackaged in a way to just be presented to people to consume, rather than how it be organically handed down usually.
I also think too that, and I don't have any like malice towards these kinds of creators. I'm not really even sure what to call them. Online personalities, whatever. There's like a certain arrogance or maybe certainty with which that they're sharing this information. And I've even had the reaction of like, where did you get this from? Like, who are you talking to? It's so like unmoored from a context that makes sense, that it seems fake. And in some respect it is. And I think for a lot of people, they're coming from this, like I said, like they did, like up until this point, or up until a few years ago, lead these very sort of modern lives. So it's not even like they're sharing something that they grew up with. It's new to them as much as it is to everyone around them. And I think the question is like, well, is that really a problem if like they're getting at something true and time tested? Like, of course they're gonna stumble at first, but maybe it's worth letting these people stumble, because practice makes perfect, and this is how you reconstitute stability.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense that your community that's going to self-select into internet content creation is not going to be your community that probably started off super traditional. And so a lot of people are going to be migrating from other lifestyles. And I think there is a lot of, value in that, because there are a lot of people who find themselves kind of in the rat race in a big city, or find themselves kind of working their way through kind of modern corporate culture, and then take a step back and go, okay, what am I doing with my life? Where's the meaning? Is this really how I want to spend these key years of my life? And they really do start making those changes, and there's value in having that communicated. But at the same time, there is, I guess both, right? Like knowing, maybe communicating what you've learned, but communicating in a way where you are learning along with the audience, rather than you are kind of the wizened, elder bringing down this knowledge from experience. Maybe that's the more productive way to go about that, or a way that makes it kind of easier to follow along and not feel that kind of backlash.
I think, there are people who are very honest about their roots. Simon Saris and Alex Kashuta are two that come to mind, where they're like, from the jump, they were like, we came from the rationalist community, and we didn't like what we were doing, and we came to this way of life, and it felt right. And we're learning as much as you're learning, as much as we're sharing. And if you've noticed, like, those are two of the more popular people out there. And I think it's because like they make no illusions about who they are. So when they say like, I'm leading a more traditional life, of course you believe them. And like, you wouldn't, like, they're just sharing something that's happening to them very organically. So I do think that like, when people are just like real about like, I'm a product of my environment, and I want to change, it's way harder to be like, oh, you're a LARPer. It's like, oh, you're a person with evolving beliefs, and that's great. It's good that you're finding happiness.
Yeah, and it can also be weird, this is not a large channel or anything, but even as I get a little more into the online space, it is odd. I'm just in general still having conversations with people I saw that I wanted to talk to, but you do start realizing and having an awareness of like an audience and people listening and thinking about what you're talking about. And that does kind of change things. It's a weird thing that I don't know a lot of people really think about before they kind of get started into this type of thing. And so it can, obviously you have people get into that and are very opportunistic, and they just see, where the clicks are, or and don't get me wrong, like I'm not here to knock anybody for building an audience, but I can see how you can get out over your skis when you see a positive reaction from pursuing a certain line of thought or a certain lifestyle, or taking a certain tone of authority or understanding with those kind of things, especially when you're new to this kind of environment, if that makes sense. I can see how that you could go down that road pretty quickly.
Totally. And I mean, I find that, and I'm not going to name any names, but like when I think of the creators who I feel like I would call LARPers, they're also like 21, and they're kind of just like up their own ass anyway because they're 21,
Mm-hmm.
or like if not, literally 21, like they're younger than 25. And that's kind of the nature of like, wow, you suddenly got a lot of attention and you're super young, and maybe you're making a decent chunk of change for the first time in your life off of your writing or your videos or your podcasting, or what have you. And that feels good too, because it's you're building something, and it's people are buying you, and that's really addictive, and it's also feels as good as any other form of entrepreneurship does.
Yeah, no, I remember the first time I wrote something for, not a very large newspaper, but just like I heard someone talking about something I wrote, and like it was what happened. I was like, oh, well, this is weird. This is a weird thing to have where, I wrote something as news, and people take it seriously. You're not really ready for that until that happens. So I can definitely see how that goes. But another aspect of the LARP thing that I think is interesting is that, right now, and you are correct to point out that it is often a upper middle class phenomena. That's a good point to make, though I think it might increasingly become something that's a little more normal as the consequences of the upper class lifestyle spread out amongst the culture. But it is interesting that because our culture has kind of become so much what it is, especially with COVID just accelerating everything. Everybody's online all of the time. The vast majority of their socialization is online, unless you're in a few key states that don't have those kind of lockdowns. And so more and more people are living lives online and in this atomized space. And so I wonder if we're going to see, basically trying on anything different is going to be LARPing. And I wonder, unless you do live in a very traditional community, you're Mormon, or you're an Orthodox Jewish person, or you're somebody who has a very active, community in a very traditional sense. I imagine anybody who's trying to do anything that is not the mainstream American culture is by necessity going to be in some way LARPing.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also like I really don't know anymore because I'm living in San Francisco now, and I lived in New York for a little bit as as a younger person, and in Austin as well, which is sort of caught between both worlds, and I can't tell, like I I feel like people who I work with, and like I said, my own family, like they lead these very sort of like regular lives. Like their friends, like they have groups of friends who they met in college or high school, and those have been their friends for years and years and years. And both of my younger sisters are, if not on, if not engaged on a marriage track with someone, and it's all, it's all going on like a very normal timeline. And like I can't tell if this is a problem that's on the coasts and in these big cities, or is this a problem that's everywhere. I just don't know, because I feel like I know so many people who are they're isolated because of COVID, and maybe they feel a little bit screwed over professionally because of the because of economic circumstances, but their relationships are exactly what people seem to want, and they're not, they're not Mormon, they're not Orthodox Jew, they're just regular, secular CNN watching Americans.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't live in a super urban area, so I definitely don't see the extremes that that get reflected in kind of, I guess, more of these online spaces where it is a lot of people who are on the coast and are doing that. But I also think that, well, I guess there are of course people I know getting married, and part of that is because I am in a little more classic faith tradition and probably have kind of friends more from those communities. A lot of, especially the community I'm involved with and work in that kind of thing, that's not the case. It is very, people do get around to marriage eventually, a lot of times, but kind of looking back at that more traditional dating scene, finding people inside of kind of a normal community setting, I feel like that is going by the wayside for a lot of people. And I wonder, if that, again, I think you will see that effect less outside of those, kind of those packed urban settings. But I feel like I do see that kind of in the average person, to a lesser extent, but I think it is happening, in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely like, demolished in the Bay Area, for example. So I do believe it, but sometimes I catch myself and I'm like, what, where am I getting this? Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is this just my own experience, or is this, like my sister, my middle sister reads my Substack, and she's like, I like it, it's great, but like, this does not reflect my life at all. Like, where where did this come from? And I have to think like, well, shit, yeah, San Francisco, of course, New York, of course, but is it like this in Florida? I don't know. I mean, it's also, now that I'm saying this out loud, I think the American South also has a much different landscape, um, than even just the rest of the country. So that could be part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a huge part, and and there's a myriad of things going on with that. Uh, you're seeing a big fleeing of people from other parts of the country down, especially to places like Florida, because they don't have that kind of COVID restriction. But there is certainly a different culture. Florida is really more northeast than most of the South. There's the old joke with Florida is the further south, the further north you go in Florida, the further south you get. And so you really do have a lot more of kind of the Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey transplants through most of the heavily populated parts of Florida. But then, of course, something like Georgia and Alabama, that kind of thing, and Carolinas are a very different experience. And I think there is definitely value to remember that the things that get portrayed in TV and the things that get put out in magazines and columns do tend to be very New York and San Francisco, New York, California centric. So it's a bad thing to judge the entirety of the country by that. But I think those things also lead the experience. I think in many ways, the kind of the elite culture there does drive a lot of the expectations of people. And so even if their reality doesn't match what they read in New York or California, it does become a little bit of not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it is something that informs the decisions of a lot of people, especially those that are kind of upwardly mobile, which then tends to trickle down in the culture.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like when you're in it, when you're living in like like Winter Park, Florida or something, or somewhere in South Carolina, you do have this like hunger to get to California or New York, and what and what you've become accustomed to your whole life is passé, and they're doing it wrong. And these girls in New York are so cool, and you want to emulate their lifestyle. So I totally agree. Like these big cities really do drive trends, and that sets the tone for the rest of the country, in general.
Well, and what's interesting is with some of these people who we've been talking about who kind of are in that traditionally elite faction, but are now taking a step back and looking at more traditional lifestyles. I wonder, does that start to then make kind of that upwardly mobile 20 or 30% in these more, suburban or rural areas start thinking twice about making that move, especially as work becomes, more mobile and you have those options of working from home more often just out of necessity after COVID. I wonder if that does make more and more people start to consider opting out. I mean, do you want to move into a place where you're going to be locked down for the next 3 years every time someone gets a new disease, while you're also paying an insane amount for a small apartment somewhere and you have an impossible time raising a family? Or if you have the option to do your job from the neighborhood you grew up in, down the street from your mom so that she can help you raise kids, are you going to choose that? Is that going to really change the dynamic of people who might otherwise have gotten onto that elite track?
I definitely think so. And I definitely think, when I've been writing about trends, like I said, I have been thinking about it really through this lens of the people I know in San Francisco, the people I know in New York. I do think like whether this is an attitude that's throughout the whole country or it's just concentrated in these major metropolitan areas, I do think we're going to see like a really big, really intense backlash against this sort of no holds bars, anything goes attitude that's been very popular in these circles since I would say like 2008 for me is when things really felt like, wow, they're let's goodbye boundaries, anything goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I think that the kind of impetus to move into these areas and then adopt that lifestyle because that's what's really available and what succeeds in some of those areas, with that dying down, I wonder if that does allow people to rebuild some of the kind of lost community and social fabric that they had before. Because one of the main things that I've been reading a lot about, kind of, there's this guy Christopher Lasch who has this book, Revolt of the Elites, and I'm a big fan of it because one of the phenomenons Lasch talks about is that our culture of concentrating commerce inside these urban areas and our universities and everything in those, and forcing everybody basically through this credential system, means that we're basically just skimming the top 20 or 30% of like leadership and ability and entrepreneurship out of all these regions and dumping it into these cities. And then because they're not, building families and building lives, it basically just ends up getting wasted. And these people, they work themselves to the death, for 20 years inside a corporate job, climb the ladder. They don't have any time for relationships, and they kind of live the lifestyles that we see on television, often because they have to, because that's what's available to you when you make those kind of decisions. And this has a devastating impact, not just on those people, but also on the communities that they leave, because now you're just taking out your kind of the people who would be your top leadership and be bettering your community and leading your community, enriching it, and you're just burning them up to run in the corporate wheel, and it really devastates the communities both at home and devastates the people who kind of join in this kind of IQ shredder that these cities run and these corporations run in kind of our coastal elite areas.
I mean, it's a huge shame that until recently you couldn't really you couldn't move up in your career or even make a certain wage if you didn't leave your hometown. And I think that's one of the big positives of COVID. Like, I could feasibly move back home now and I could be closer to my family. And it's not a choice of, all right, do I want to have a nice lifestyle and have a career that I feel fulfilled by, or do I want to be near my family? And I felt like that was like always, always the choice for me. Like when my mom wanted me to move back home so badly when I graduated college, and I just was like, I actually ended up getting married as soon as I graduated. And my ex-husband, like, there was certainly no work for him in Florida. And we had to go wherever the good jobs were.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly know a lot of people who ended up in situations where even when, like, say, when they did get married, they had to, uproot and move, and that, of course, makes building careers more difficult. You have to match careers if both people are working. It makes it harder to start a family. You're away from extended family, which are going to help you to kind of invest time into that. And so those are all things that are going to shake up what would have been the normal rhythms of life. What would have been kind of the natural progression if you had been in your hometown, gotten out of your education, started working, been married, just kind of these things that would have naturally moved forward are constantly uprooted, are constantly disrupted by this need to uproot and search and sift. And who knows if your company is going to, downsize or move people, work overseas or shift you over to the other coast for a different office. And all of a sudden everything is is up in the air again. And that really makes it difficult, of course, for individuals who are unattached. But even for those that are, it makes it harder to kind of fall into what we would think of as a more traditional lifestyle.
Totally. I mean, the work piece is so big. Your point about, like, you don't know if you're going to have to move is another one, because you could invest 6 years in a community, and then suddenly it's like, if you want to pay your bills, you have to move to Illinois or move to Massachusetts, and well, you've already established yourself in New York, and it's really stressful. And I think we trivialize how stressful it is that you can't really form a relationship with a community or a place in general. Like, forget the individual people, but just falling in love with and putting roots down in your physical location and getting to know the physical environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. I think especially this is something because I was a guy who I worked in kind of traditional Republican politics for a bit, and I was very much a GOP, American Republican, kind of supporting guy. And I spouted the line from talk radio a million times of, it's the land of opportunity and you just have to go where the jobs are and make your own way. And I look back and I just, I shake my head at that. And every time I hear someone say it now, I'm just like, what are you talking about? Because you're trying to tell me about this traditional lifestyle you want people to live, and this, kind of go back to kind of this family and community oriented thing. We need this social fabric, bonding people together. But at the same time, you're totally disinterested in building any of the structures that would allow that. You're totally on board with allowing companies to rip up and uproot and basically make sure no one has any kind of security. And what happens to that community when, like you said, you've invested 5-6 years at your local church or at your local library, or building up even just something like a game night with your friends, and all of a sudden that's gone and you have to restart everything again. Those communities, they fall apart when people aren't consistent and active with them. And I think one of the things that people who are looking to promote that kind of return to that kind of lifestyle have to really start coming to grips is this is not just like a, hey, people should do this is how people should act thing. You have to have a system in place. You have to have a structure in place that allows these communities to grow and be stable, and allow people to make those investments in a way that's going to be safe and secure, and is not going to be torn up every time the CEO decides that they need to reshift the balance sheets one direction or the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that the company becomes a family under these circumstances. Of course, like, mandatory fun and retreats become very attractive, and like the startup sort of lifestyle, like what we've been taught, that is people make fun of it, but when you're in it, you really do become very close with your coworkers, and it's a vicious trick, because once you grow, those coworkers can be laid off, and it because it's not your family, it's a business. But those, and for a lot of people, those are the only people that you know for sure. Like if they get transferred offices, you'll definitely see them. There's a connection there. There's a line of communication that's being supported by something. So it's a weird thing. Like I think it's very easy to make fun of people in that situation, but if you don't have another choice, you can't just have nobody.
Yeah, and it reminds me a little bit, I grew up on military bases. My dad was in the military. It reminds me a little bit of, kind of military families, because you're in a very unique situation and everybody's going to get reposted or restationed or reassigned in 6 months to 2 years. You're kind of in this weird scenario where everyone is in a kind of this transitory friendship. You have to make friends, you have to have social connections, but you can also only be so connected to people because at any moment, like it's just going to be cut, but they're still the best people to make friends with or to build connections with because no one else is going to understand. No one else is going to understand this, well, we could have to pack up and move in 2 weeks thing. And so you do kind of have your own, kind of community, as awkward and artificial as it becomes when you are the only people sharing that type of experience and there's really not another option outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, online communities too, I think are starting to, especially in the age of COVID, are starting to, fill this role too. I think like what's interesting is I think that these communities are going to pop up wherever they can, however they can. And it takes a lot to really stomp them out. I was thinking about how like in certain cities, like even if it's just all sprawl and like strip malls and McDonald's and stuff, people find a way to be like, well, this is the McDonald's that we all hang out at, and this is our only option for getting pizza is Little Caesars, but this is the Little Caesars that we wrote our names on the wall at, or people find a way to make these very sterile kind of mundane things their own. And it takes a lot of energy just to like completely like wipe that out. And it bubbles up and finds a way out in all these weird and dysfunctional ways when it's not allowed to thrive in like a normal organic way.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. That's something you certainly see in places like YouTube, where you have this product that a lot of people who are running the show certainly want to just turn it into, CNN or Fox News or entertainment channels. They just want the next America's Got Talent or whatever on there. But as long as you allow a community involvement, which is what built the space in the first place, you do get these weird and different corners that are constantly like working to kind of evolve and change and produce these kind of things. And so I guess, it is this weird situation where people are adapting in these very awkward ways, and there's these growing pains as they do so. But I guess that means that there's hope that those things can transfer. I think there is a limit. This is something that gets talked about a lot in my community. There's only so much you can do online. Face to face has a quality all of its own, and of course, if you're in a local town like you were talking about, that is different. But I think for the online spaces, that does make a difference. And of course, this cultural shift also does make the weird spaces online because of what happens in like the workspace we were talking about, because you've got these these workspaces that become family. You've got these workspaces where these are the only people you really see on a regular basis, because people kind of lost some of the church and the other things that would drive them out, friend groups and community organizations that would drive them out to meet other people. But at the same time, you can't really be yourself around the people during mandatory fun, right? Like everybody knows the horror story of somebody who had one too many drinks at the mandatory fun and ends up ruining their career. And so you get this really awkward situation where, you can't really, you're not equipped to meet people and date outside of work. But work is also a place where you can't also navigate it to date, because even though that's where most people would meet their spouses, The rules and the awkwardness and everything that is now in the modern workplace kind of makes that extremely dangerous to navigate as well. And so you see people, moving to things like online dating because it's the only place where you can meet people in a manner you're maybe more comfortable with, it's not going to burn you if something goes wrong like it would in an environment like work.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I have pretty mixed feelings about online dating. I think for some people it definitely works. But one argument I find myself like getting into a lot with people is like, your standards become like so much higher. Well, not even higher. They just become like really warped when it's just filtered through an app. And you're either looking at the person's looks only, or maybe their workplace, or like some kind of signal that they're valuable, but only in like a particular dimension. And what I feel like has been really lost is like being attracted to these like unquantifiable things, like even, like picking up on someone's pheromones and this kind of physical chemistry. I find like people don't even believe me that exists anymore. And I'm like, what are you talking? Like, how this is the most fundamental part of being alive, like having physical chemistry with another person. And I find that I'm constantly arguing with people about whether or not it's even a thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely the case. And thank God I got to dodge the online dating scene, because I don't think I would have enjoyed that at all. But you're right that there is this thing that when you kind of, it's the spreadsheetification of everything, right? Like when everything is a box on an app and a form you fill out, or a category you put things into officially on something, you miss that connective tissue. You miss that stuff that's, in the margins, where you'd be interacting with someone, and maybe the way they are around a friend, or the way they treat someone that they don't have to treat well, or like you said, just like the physical electricity of being near someone, and like how that sets you off when you are. Those are things that you're just never going to pick up when you're staring at a screen on your phone trying to figure out which way to swipe. And that's definitely impacting some of the fundamental things that I think make relationships work.
Completely. And I'm sympathetic with the like incel perspective. And I think that they're totally right if you're talking about a digital forward world only. Because like I feel like my own taste even changed, like comparing to when I could only meet people in person versus like I was mostly meeting people online. Like I had no concept of like, oh, the person I date has to look X, Y, and Z ways. Like not even subconsciously, because I was totally going on like, well, who's the class clown, or like who, like whatever thing, like who am I just naturally sort of gravitating towards. And though whoever that person was, they looked a whole bunch of different ways, they were different ages, it was just such a wide range of possibilities there, because you don't really know what you're picking up on when you're attracted to someone in person. It could be anything, and it could just be like this very primal, again, like unquantifiable thing. And it's just that's totally erased. It's erased with like friendships too. If you're only meeting people through meetup groups or Twitter, or whatever online thing that people use to make friends.
Yeah, and it's also assuming this thing where we know ourselves, right? Like where I know what I want. I know what I'm going to want out of this person, and I can write that down, and if they fill those things in, then that's what's going to work. But we don't know ourselves, especially in the realm of something like physical attraction. And so when we cut ourselves off from experience and we try to like curate who we're going to interact with, both as friends and romantically, we lose opportunities to learn things about ourselves, and let very organic things that would otherwise play out kind of inform that interaction of those relationships and how we move forward.
Yeah, and people don't know how to read other people either. Is a big thing.
Yeah, no, I mean that's huge, and it's it's very odd because if anyone had met me at like 13, they would have been like, oh, autism, great, right? And so it's weird that I wouldn't say I'm any kind of person whisperer, but I definitely became I think probably somewhere in my like mid 20s, I became much more emotionally aware. Like I became better at reading other people, understanding people's needs, feeling things out in conversations that aren't said, things that that the guy who was memorizing like history facts did not pick up on. And so I do see that people who I feel like should be better at reading people than me aren't anymore, if that makes sense. You know, like people who seem like they should be like biologically equipped to be more personable and interact with people better than I do don't. And I think that is in some ways a function of kind of the lifestyle that people are choosing to live in, the way they interact.
Yeah, you can't, there's no substitute for experience is the thing. And I also feel like a lot of people are kind of like brainwashed to like, I again, like I have so many conversations, whether it's for the advice column or it's, you know, friends here in the Bay, where they present this like very obvious sort of textbook situation. And they're like, well, I don't want to make any assumptions about this person, or like, I don't want to box someone in based on like maybe their gender or whatever thing. And it's like the conventional wisdom is right. Like, stop, you don't overanalyze it. There's no like mystical quality here. Like yeah, like not all men, but also in general, yes, you can men and women do behave in kind of predictable ways, and you don't need to remove everything that we've learned over the years to find equality.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly has been the project of modernity, right? Is to kind of, well, you don't need this generalization anymore, and that can't be useful. And it's funny, if you read books before 1900, people use the word prejudice differently. Now when people say prejudice, they mean, obviously like, treating someone poorly based on, an immutable characteristic. But if you read it before a certain time, prejudices were just the accurate understandings of the world and how you use to judge them, right? And so when we understand that most men who present a certain attitude are going to move in this direction, and certain women who do this thing are more likely to move this direction, and we can make very basic assumptions on the data, where it feels like there's a war on pattern recognition, which is like the basis of intelligence. But we seem to be at odds and try to be fighting the human understanding and pattern recognition that makes us functional.
But it's coming, like like these things always find their way back because they're so essential. Like I have friends who won't for the life of them say a 21-year-old man is probably going to act in X, Y, and Z ways, but they will turn to astrology, which is actually saying the same exact thing, and say, oh, well, he's a Gemini, so ... And it's like, you're just removing, it's the same thing. You're just swapping up the labels so it fits the current moment better. I mean, if you look at like the popularity of astrology, or like using tarot cards to guide your daily decisions, it's like, it's that sort of like pattern matching that people know is really useful, that they're like very afraid to just, be normal, do it, do it the way we've been doing it and has been fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this petrifies people because they know there's a certain dynamic that should play out. They can feel the tension. They fall into these kind of patterns of being that, work across time and culture and kind of are eternally true. And we feel them. We feel them happening, but we're not supposed to, or we're not supposed to see it, or we're not supposed to understand it. And so but like you said, they do eventually, you can only be at war with reality for so long. And those skills are too valuable, and those abilities are too useful. And no matter how much, technology you put between people, those soft skills are always going to be, key and core. And so I think you're right that in some ways they do have to come back again, though I think that road may unfortunately be longer than I'd like, and maybe many others. But you did bring up incels there, and I certainly don't want to turn this into like the incel discussion, because that community has always confused me a little bit. But I did want to touch on it just because you had brought it up. I look at the incel community and I think to myself, that's just the most modern of problems, right? Because I feel like it comes from two directions. The idea that there's a bunch of men that are unattached is nothing new in history. Like literally, like raiding bands of guys in communities that didn't have enough women would like go out and capture them, right? So like this is not a new problem under the sun. But a lot of normally kind of your male population, many would die off in war and these kind of things, and otherwise be found unsuitable, and so that kind of paired along with kind of the more monogamous structure of many traditional societies kind of solved the unattached man problem for a lot of people today, due to the lack of generational wars and that kind of thing, at least on wide scale, and kind of this more unattached lifestyle that people are leading, the more casual dating. You're seeing a lot more kind of the Pareto distribution. Women are kind of dating the upper echelon of men, and there's more men in the lower echelon around than have ever been before. And I think this kind of necessarily creates a situation that's going to manufacture a lot of people in that situation.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's a whole bunch of things working against everyone. I feel like I think also women are conditioned to not give people a chance. Again, like especially in these sort of like upper middle class cosmopolitan communities, there's this this emphasis like men are trash. Don't like, these are red flags, you have to like recognize them immediately, and there's no sort of like putting things in context. Like one piece of dating advice I always give is like, unless it's like you really know, like you're repulsed by this person, or they mentioned something that's like beyond the pale, like give them 3 dates to push you away. Because usually if you give someone 3 dates, it's enough time to see enough of their true colors to know one way or another. But I also think like between like the expectation that you sleep with someone on the first date, and then just like this sense of like you need to move through people as quickly as possible. People like men who should have girlfriends don't, because they're going through like hundreds of first dates. And I know a whole bunch of people don't get any dates or any matches at all, on the other hand. But I think the way we dispose of people, and I really think that's the only word that I can use, is like totally, it's creating a lot of problems for men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of those things that when you lose that tight knit community, it incentivizes that behavior because, don't get me wrong. Like, the popular handsome guy can probably have more of a pick than normal throughout all cultures. But if you're in kind of a more traditional community, or even just a more closer knit community, if you're, running through people and you're treating people poorly and you're kind of discarding people, without giving them a chance, or without putting effort into them, people notice. And even if you're not saying you're not doing anything heinous, you're not doing anything super objectionable, but just the fact that you kind of have a reputation for not really giving people a chance, and not sticking around will dissuade more people, and so it kind of curbs some of that behavior. You have to be more careful with the way you treat people, even when it is time to move on, which I think we lose. And I think you're also right that just, kind of the increased pressure and expectations, if you're not, ready to sleep together on the first date, or if you're not ready to, if they're not, ticking all these boxes, well, there's someone else in the app, there's someone else to go for. You don't have to spend time or invest in people. I think is a big mistake. I tell people this all the time, when I see them ready to move on. If it's healthy and there's problems, that's one thing. But if you're just I don't like this, or I'm not feeling this, it's like, guys, everybody's a work in progress, and people are usually worth what you put into them. And don't get me wrong, you want them to be putting something into you as well. You want them to be putting time and effort and building that relationship. It needs to go both ways. But if your plan is to just run through these relationships and never really invest in somebody, and cut bait the minute you see something you don't like, then don't be surprised when you're miserable. You kind of earned that one.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing too is, I think that for people who are in communities where they don't have like strong friendships, they also use dating as a proxy for social experiences. So there's this sense of, and I see this especially in young women, where they don't want to have a boyfriend because they're effectively like using men as stepping stones into communities or into experiences that they otherwise wouldn't have. So this would either be like something like dating rich men so they get a taste of that lifestyle, but really like thinking of it in the same sense of like, oh, I'm going to book a trip to Thailand, or I'm going to book a trip to Cambodia to experience like a new culture. Or like, oh, like dates are where I'm going to get the opportunity to like go rock climbing or do this, or, try eat at this restaurant. And I think that's also wrong too. Like, you shouldn't view men as proxies for, doorways into experiences. There's like this huge encouragement, like, we'll just do it for this story, or like, if it doesn't work out, at least you have the story. Well, like, why do you need the story, and why does this other person need to be how you live this story if you do need it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that's something that's approaching it from an angle. I think that's something a lot of guys would recognize, but maybe not think of that way. I'm going to snag this super chat real quick. Belaforius Knight, I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Thanks for the donation, man. It says, for a 25-year-old late bloomer, online dating sucks. And yeah, I can imagine, man. I have this weird experience because I was, I was kind of married young and then widowed. And so I kind of also started dating again in my mid 30s. And so I have this weird kind of two-part, I've kind of been on both ends of that spectrum. Luckily, I didn't have to meet my current wife online, so I didn't have to do the online dating thing. So plug into those communities, guys. But at the same time, I definitely can see, even from just a little bit of the toe I dipped into that, that is, anything else you can find is probably preferable, at least for me in the long run. So. But yeah, guys, if you have any other questions, we're coming up on an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and probably wrap this up soon. But if you have any other questions, you can post them before we go. Sorry, I forgot to shill for you here. You've got a Substack, which I've linked in the video description, which I suggest people go check out. Like I said, it's a nice mix of kind of the different genres we were talking about and different perspectives that people should definitely check out. Are there any other places you want people to plug into your work?
I think Substack's the best place right now.
Okay. All right. So, guys, definitely go follow Default Friends Substack there and check out her work. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Like I said, I know it's a little different from what's normally on the channel, but I thought it would be interesting, a different perspective. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. And thanks, everybody, for joining me. Have a good one. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.